Okay, today we're talking about finding the right balance of value and color in your painting. And of course, it fits in with certain subjects better than others. And you have that strong contrast of dark and light, a lot of backlighting sometimes. But the idea that you want a balance of dark and light values. And by balance, I don't mean equal amounts of dark and light, but we want one to dominate over the other. I've got a couple of images here to talk about that with. It's a painting I did a few years ago where it has a strong shadow here in the foreground, travels up the trees as well, but then it balanced by a sunlit background. And the image I used had a lot of sunlight here in the foreground and some shadow in the background. And it made it just a jumbled mess of dark and light. But if I could balance it better to where I have more solid darks and lights and create shapes with those few, 3 or 4 solid dark and light shapes, I'm going to have better balance. I always want one to dominate over the other. And in this one, I have more dark than light. Sometimes you can have more light than dark, but you don't want half and half. So again, I got the foreground hill, half the trees in shadow. Background mountains aren't necessarily in shadow, but they're a dark value. And that contrasts the smaller shape of the light snow and field. A little bit of light there in the light sky and some light on the trees. So I'm contrasting dark foreground against lighter background. And in some areas, lighter foreground against darker background. Looking for that contrast and then making sure one dominates over the other. And the same thing with the color. The cooler color dominates over the warmer color. You don't want half and half, just like you don't want your shapes being equal, same size, same shape. Same thing with color. I want one temperature mainly here to dominate over another temperature, kind of create a balance of that. So looking at some photographs, and this has that lighting where there's light coming through, it's hitting the trees here, hitting some of the trees back in here, and then also on the foreground. So it's given me quite a variety of shapes and values, and a little bit too much, which is usually the case. Like when I look in here, there's not a good balance of dark and light. It's kind of jumbled up. Same thing in here, kind of jumbled up. Here it's more definite, light and dark. But I want to create shapes and masses of value that give me a good design. One value would dominate over the other. And the more you can think through that before you start painting on subjects like this, the less problem you'll have. And the first thing we want to think about always is composition. And this would be my focal area right here where the yellow leaves are against the dark trunks and a little bit darker background, and have some of it over in here on the left side. So I'm going to cut off more on the right side and then some on the left side. But I want this area to be off center. I don't want that center. That's more my focal point. I don't need all this foreground, but I can use some of it. And a lot of times with the taller trees, usually a more square or vertical composition tends to work better. This painting is a square. Looks vertical, but it's a 30 by 30. A horizontal just wouldn't work as well because I'm trying to emphasize the height of the trees, height of the mountains in the background. So same thing here, I'm emphasizing the height of the yellow trees, the pine trees. I do want to do something with the idea of these 2 tree trunks being too centered. This is the middle, and these 2 tree trunks are equally spaced on either side. So I would want to get rid of that in the painting. Maybe just get rid of one of the trunks here, maybe the one on the left side. But what I want to do here is really emphasize the shadowed foreground and dark tree trunks against the lighter sunlit yellow trees. And they're going to be contrasted against a darker background. So I'm going to get rid of all this indecision that's here, back in here, and really force things into those few large shapes of dark and light to make it work better. So first thing I want to do is just the foreground, simplify that idea of, not too much going on here. There's a lot of light shadow in this foreground here, and in here, but just simplify it. Simple dark and light path, dark and light grass. Then I want to jump to the background. And what I'm doing is I'm forcing everything behind these light yellow trees darker and cooler. A lot cooler and lighter than the photograph shows. Although the photograph's not bad. It's a nice cool blue-green back in there. Kind of playing off that. But forcing everything back there cooler, lighter. Some of the darks up front here, in front of these yellow trees, are in the shadow, so that's going to be a little darker. Again, looking for areas where I can really force value changes. Same thing over here, more dark to make the yellow stand out. And some of the colors that aren't yellow or aren't green, blue-green or yellow-green. And that's that violet in here. And that's just representing some of the bare branches. It also gives me a little bit of a complementary feel of the yellow and violet. So forcing that in there, thinking in terms of just these bare branches I see in here, and a lot of it I see here. This is kind of towards the end of autumn, so leaves were almost done. And then the light area in the foreground, again, just simplifying, pulling things together. And this is the block in. This is the important part of the block in, is it simplifies everything before you start the detail. If I start seeing too many color changes, too many value changes, not going to work. I need to simplify it first, then decide where to break it up. Then lastly, I'll go with the lighter, more the focal point here, the lighter leaves, and emphasize the darker trunks. So I'm playing off the sunlit middle ground yellow trees against a darker, cooler background. And also playing off the middle ground yellow trees against the darker, cooler foreground. And the darker, cooler foreground is darker than the background. And the middle ground is in the middle. So sounds complicated, but I've hopefully taken something that's pretty busy, hard to figure out what to do with all that stuff, and forced it into bigger, simpler shapes, creating more balance with the dark and light. I've got more dark here than light, and the light is contrasted by that darker background and foreground. And I went a little bit, again, a little bit cooler, lighter in the background than what's there, just to create more depth. Within the light, the yellow and the yellow-orange, I've got, again, kind of a variation of yellows, starting with yellow, yellow-orange, a little bit towards yellow-green, so I can vary that within the light. And the thing with these bright yellow leaves, yellow is a very light color. It's a light valued color, so even in the shadow, and there is some shadow in here, even the shadow is very light. But more importantly, I want to offset it against the darker background, darker foreground. So I do have some value change within the yellow, but it's not going to be very much. Even the shadow of the yellow is going to be light. So finding those simple patterns, trying to balance the light and dark. Also the temperature. More cool color and smaller amounts of warm color, but that makes the warm really jump out. Using not a lot of negative space too. The background, I could use that even more so to cut into the yellow space, create a bit more sense of detail if I need to. Now going to the next photograph here, similar type of thing. I have, in this case, it's the reverse. I have a dark focal point of these yellow-orange trees and a lighter background. Here I had a darker background, lighter yellow trees, and then dark foreground. So I'm going to focus on keeping the background lighter and the foreground darker. Now to make that lighter background stay in the distance, I have to mute it slightly. So if I'm going to use yellow oranges, yellow greens, they're going to have a little bit of the complement. That'll knock it down some, and I'll keep the color in the shadows a bit stronger. So first thing I'll do here is find those between, again, a slightly muted yellow-green, kind of a muted yellow-orange, and I'm cutting in between those shapes of the trees. And in my drawing, I would mass in these yellow, shadowed yellow trees, kind of in the foreground, mass them in dark. Not real dark, because they're not, again, that yellow-orange is not a real dark color, but it is going to be darker than the background. So just a real light, blue, burnt sienna A lot of turpentine in it just to thin it down and make sure it's not very dark. Sometimes I will come back with a paper towel or a rag and kind of wipe over it if my tone for the drawing is too dark. Just kind of don't get it too dark. It is going to be a shadow, but not that much shadow. Now, I've also introduced a little bit of background behind the background. So I have the background yellow, muted yellow, yellow greens, and behind that I have a darker, cooler, whether it's hills, mountains, trees, I don't really care. Just something to create more depth. Because that background is so warm, those trees, that bluish background works a little bit better. Then I can come in and get my darker foreground here. The color's fairly strong though. It's a little stronger than the background. Even though the background is sunlit, this is stronger because it's closer, more the focal point. It's a pretty strong color anyway. And again, the violet kind of introduces those bare branches. I'm not looking to replicate trees. I'm kind of taking what's there in the photograph and using them to create something, hopefully, that gives me a balance of dark and light and warm and cool color. So you can see the trees kind of disappear. These foreground trees that are in shadow, they kind of blend into the light, kind of blend into the sky, to the background, especially if I take everything away. But again, getting those foreground trees darker, a little stronger color, lighter background, a little bit more muted, really separates and creates a better balance of dark and light. And then the dark pine trees, I just want to shape, silhouetted shape against that lighter background. And then going back to the background, just adding more, because I'm trying to make these foreground shadow trees stand out. They're kind of middle ground, but and so I'm going back into that background color, again, light, muted, warm color to make those darker, cooler color trees stand out. Looking for contrast. And a balance also. I don't want equal mass, things too evened out, nothing centered. I don't want half light, half dark. I'm going to have more dark than light here. And then lastly, in the foreground. And this simplifies that foreground a lot. Again, it just gets jumbled up between the color of the leaves, the grass, then the shadow and the sunlight. So I have a dark and light green and a dark and light orange. Now I vary the color slightly in these leaf colors, but again, trying to keep it simple. And then to crop it, I'm going to have the trees here, my focal point, those strong colored shadowed trees, a little off center to the right. Again, do this with the sketchbook as well. It simplifies things. I do have this tree trunk centered a little bit. I can move it slightly to the right or left, and that's a little centered, so I might move that. But again, good balance in that there's more shadow than light, and in this case, the shadow is my focal point, those strong colored leaves. Now, I could introduce some real strong sunlight here. If there's some sunlight filtering through, and get some sunlight on here, it has to be the strongest color if I do that. And I can't do too much of it. And I would probably choose not to do it because I think it just confuses the issue. I'm not making things more simple. I'm making things more complicated. Also, when this dries, if I decide that my colored leaves here in the shadow, which are very strong, if I get them too strong and I need to knock them down, I don't have to repaint them. All I need to do is glaze them. And when we say glaze, we're talking about laying a real thin color on top of another, in this case, just to darken it, which will also slightly mute it. But if it's transparent and very thin, you'll see all the color variation, you'll see all the value variation. It'll just be slightly darker or slightly muted. In this case, it's going to be slightly muted. So I would get a lot of medium. I use liquid more than anything else, but Gamblin makes good mediums, Utrecht, Winsor Newton, all those paint names that we always use make a good medium. And you can pour the medium out on the palette, or sometimes I'll pour it in a paper bowl or plate. So it's kind of in a more confined area, and the palette it tends to run a little bit more. And then just gradually add the smallest amount of color, because it doesn't take much color. And I'm going to do that here on the computer, which it does simulate it pretty well. So I reduce the opacity. In other words, I'm making this more transparent. very thin. Oh, a little bit of ultramarine blue is really all I need. Ultramarine blue is transparent, and I can take it, and you can see I'm knocking down the sunlit areas too. But I can glaze all the dark leaves, and all it does is the color's still there, value changes are still there. It just makes everything slightly darker. And I could even do the whole painting if I wanted to. Let me get rid of this. Speaking of glazes here, just a real quick. Sometimes you do a painting and you need to either slightly darken or lighten the whole thing. Again, a very transparent glaze of ultramarine blue. Sometimes add a little bit of crimson, that's transparent also. And I can do a lot here, and you can see it. This is the effect of glazing. I'm not changing the color, even though I'm using color. It's 98% medium. But I can knock down everything. If I get things too light, I need to darken everything. That's what that does. Now when I take it away, you can see it's a subtle change there. Glaze will do that. It'll just knock it. Things are too bright, too light. A transparent glaze will work. Now if I need to lighten the shadow, that's a scumble. And that's same thing, a lot of medium, but this time a touch of white. Not much. So same thing here. It doesn't really matter the color as much. Here I'm going to get it. There'll be a little bit of, if I want to lighten this shadow of this tree here, and that has too much white in it. That's a little better. Yeah, it's really not too much white in that too. You can see just a little bit of a glaze lightens that shadow or lightens that shadow. This is actually a scumble. When you add white to the glaze, it becomes opaque or semi-opaque, and that's a scumble, not a glaze. And you can see the difference here. So you see the difference in this tree on the left. The glaze can knock it down. It still has the same coloring, same value changes within the shape. Now, you add too much white, it becomes too opaque and it covers up what's there. And I don't want to do that. I just want to either subtly lighten a shape or the whole painting, or subtly darken a shape or the whole painting. Now moving on, couple of paintings here. Let's get off the idea of glazing. Here's another one here. I'm going to crop my focal point or the trees here. This can be a bit more horizontal. Again, I want to get the yellow trees off center. And they're off center a little bit to the left, balanced by the tree trunk here, more towards the right of center. And this time we have this sunlit yellow. Even though some of it's in shadow, most of it's in yellow. And that's what I'm going for, is to treat this yellow mass as light against the darker background. And then a light middle ground against a darker foreground. Looking for that contrast and balance of dark and light and cool and warm. So the first thing again is that background. Cooling it off slightly, but not too much. I could a little bit more, create more distance in there. But I created another layer of a little more, same color, just bluer and a little lighter. And then going for the sunlit leaves here. Now these are in shadow, this darker orange. This is the sunlit part of the yellow-orange tree. But even the shadow in this case is just part of the light because it is, again, that color is so light. It might be considered more halftone over in there, but it's still the yellow-orange trees set off against the darker, cooler background trees. And then the foreground, simplifying that too, so it just reads better. So going from here to here, pulls it together, it simplifies it, creating more contrast, trying to separate the darks and lights a bit more, make them easier, simpler shapes to mass in. Try not to get things too centered. So if I go back to the beginning here, again, it has the workings of what I want there. It's plain to see, but if we try and paint it like that, not going to work as well. So that simplification is what's going to make it work. So a couple of other paintings here. This is a painting I did in Flagstaff. And again, it has that, even though the background, the background is in shadow. Even though the foreground trees are in shadow, there's still the light shape against the darker, cooler background. because again, that yellow is so light. And the shadowed tree trunks, again, are light shape against the darker background. And, well, actually, tree trunks are darker than the background, but against the dark pine tree there. But pushing, simplifying, finding bigger shapes to push things into, and trying to balance the dark and the light and the cool and the warm color. Now this is a John Carlson doing the same thing here. He's got some dappled light on these tree trunks, but for the most part, these tree trunks in front are dark, and the background, at least on this side, is light, and the mountains are light. But he has, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, and kind of a darker sky. So it's a lot of variations of dark and light shapes here, but he's simplifying it, pushing everything into those shapes. He's got more shapes here than what we have showed, but he's still simplifying. He's still forcing everything into these bigger shapes to create a better, simpler design. And he always does a good job of having the eye follow down here at the bottom. It comes in and follow these lines and edges as they go back. Really goes around the painting real well. Really designs things nicely. And this is a Karl Moll, M-O-L-L. He was an Austrian painter. Same thing here, the darker foreground tree, dark trunk, dark green, blue-green or green, against the lighter, warmer, sunlit areas in the background. And then light, dark, light, trying to pick up that pattern of dark and light. Light here, kind of in the middle ground, darker foreground. It probably has a bit more light here than dark, so it's more of a lighter shapes dominate over the darker. So find ways to simplify these images that are more complicated. Mine happens to be looking into a forest of trees here. And they make great paintings, but if you don't simplify them, they just become too busy.